Welcome, dear friends. Today, we're going to delve into the complex dynamics of today's global economic and geopolitical landscape. Our guest is Michael Avery, a distinguished global strategist at Rabobank, a leading global bank renowned for its economic research. He's based in Singapore. Michael, well, has built a reputation for his contrarian analysis on topics such as neo-mercantilism, geopolitics, and economic statecraft. Thank you for joining us, Michael. Thank you for sharing your views on the evolving world order.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, let's start with this. How do you define economic statecraft in the current context, and how do you think it will evolve in the next 5 years for powers like the US and China?
Sure. Well, it's a well-defined topic outside of traditional market or financial market coverage areas. But essentially, I explain it to clients like this. When you talk about economic policy, which they're used to, you understand that you are going to use certain tools, for example, fiscal policy, so the government budget, or monetary policy, so interest rates, or exchange rate policy, or trade policy, for specific technocratic targets. So, for example, your budget policy will revolve around a certain budget target, like a 3% deficit or a balanced budget, for example. Monetary policy will rotate around 2% inflation very often in developed economies. FX policy actually very often doesn't exist anymore. Everything is supposed to just move according to markets in theory. And trade policy is usually about, or was about, how many free trade deals can I sign? Because just free trade, free trade, free trade. That was a nice, easy world, really. I mean, it had its complications, but overall, it was a very easy game to play. Economic statecraft is when you use all those same tools, ideally in conjunction with each other, but you are thinking about very different targets. You are thinking about national security or foreign policy goals, and or both. So, for example, and it sounds crazy, but this is the kind of thinking that I'm trying to engender in others. What's the correct interest rate to encourage Russia not to invade Ukraine? Now, I'm not saying there's a simple answer, but this is the kind of very differential thinking that you have to do. And it's not always immediately obvious. And sometimes there's a second or a third or a fourth order effect. But it changes how all the technocrats have to look at what they're doing and why they're doing it. And in fact, the simple bullet point that I've been trying to explain to people more than any other is with economic policy, you ask, what is GDP? And the answer is 2, 1.9, 2.1. This is the very boring world of financial markets where all the money goes around. In economic statecraft, you ask, what is GDP for? What's my target? It's a very, very different thing.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And you know that there are several experts warning that we are heading towards to a bifurcated world, with some of them calling it the post-American world. Do you agree with that? On and what will that world look like, and how did we get there?
I think it's a rather simple way of looking at it, but I think we are heading in general terms in that direction. I apologize. A moment ago, I didn't tell you where I thought we would be in a few years from now. So let me wrap those two questions up into one. We had a American-centric unipolar world for a long time, post-Cold War, and where the architecture, which had been built by America, along with many other willing contributors, was seen as the world system. Now, that is very unlikely to last if it still exists already today, really, when we take a step back. And I think we will be heading for a more fragmented or fractured world where you have different groupings, coalitions, blocks, constellations, whatever terminology you prefer, within which, crucially, I still think that an American-dominated system, but where America's influence and central role is much more clearly displayed, so that people alongside America don't get to really pretend that they're equal partners in it. They understand who's actually running it. Will still dominate most of the geography, but where there is certainly an increasing possibility that a structure of other economies will operate a parallel system. And it may not apply in all areas. There may be some things which are seen as neutral and which can still cross borders. But in many areas, and we already see it in technology, for example, and we will see it in many others, you are going to get segmentation, fragmentation.
Yeah. And what do you consider? Well, that's something that I hear many times in your interviews. Why do you consider that the world is actually in a global Cold War instead of a hot war? And what indicators should we monitor to detect a possible escalation?
Well, I think we are clearly in a Cold War, in that we have a clear difference between the US and China as the primary poles, and additionally Russia, which is working with China very clearly, and has its own ideology, which is not exactly the same as China's, although it correlates with it to a large degree in key areas. In terms of monitoring that, I mean, it was obvious to me when I wrote about it in 2017 that the differences between the two could not be breached, or could not be bridged, I'm sorry. And I think you actually have to argue, what can you put forward to contend that isn't the case? How can you logically build the argument that actually America and China see things the same way on every front and have the same goals? And I find that much, much harder to do. And obviously we have had and continue to have at least one hot war, Russia-Ukraine being the hottest, running contemporaneously with this, which of course we had during the last Cold War. We had several long-running wars intermittently, and that pattern is repeating itself now. The concern is, of course, the tail risk that we have more coming up, and I think the risk is that we will, hopefully not as large scale as what we've seen between Russia and Ukraine, hopefully not as large as we saw in the Middle East over the past few years, but certainly you will get friction building up in the key flashpoints along the intersecting geographies between these two emerging blocks, where certain countries, Ukraine in this particular instance, the Middle East with its oil in another, and increasingly, I would fear, even though I'm no expert on the region, Latin America possibly, are going to be contested territories to a certain degree between the great powers.
Yeah, I want to talk about that later, but I want to do this first. What exactly does the neo-mercantilistic strategy of the US under Trump consist of? And how can people like me, investors, prepare for its impact on global supply chains?
Sure. Okay. In the simplest possible terms, classical mercantilism, which we no longer have, was where a country would try to run a positive balance of trade by all means necessary. All tricks were used to make sure that they would accumulate gold and silver. Now, you can make an argument for gold or silver, even though they've had a bad week at the time of talking, but that's not what anyone's actually trying to accumulate now, apart from people who are selling gold and silver on the internet. What we have now is neo-mercantilism, which you correctly refer to, which is an emergent school of thought which followed Adam Smith's rebuttal and David Ricardo's rebuttal of classical mercantilism and said, why do you want shiny metal? What you want are factories that make things, because if you have things, you have power. You have industrial potential. Very often you have weapons, and therefore that's better than just shiny gold, because people won't sell them to you when they've got them and you haven't, which is a realpolitik we still live with today. So neo-mercantilism is about, do we have enough stuff? So the America that emerged post-World War II used to make everything. They were a military colossus, a financial colossus, and an economic colossus. They were the world's largest producer and consumer of most things. Well, of course, then we had 4.5 decades of neoliberalism where everything was outsourced. Everything was just in time, and everything was moved to Asia, pretty much. And China, which is neo-mercantilist, understood this was its fantastic opportunity to accumulate productive capital, which is what it's done. So now mostly China makes everything. And increasingly it consumes more as well because it has a larger population. So Trump's neo-mercantilism is 100% centered on making sure that America makes things again. And that's a very easy thing to say and a very hard thing to do. And it means breaking almost the entire global system.
Yeah.
Changing America's political economy completely and changing the world financial system and economic system in order to achieve it. So as an individual investor, that's the key starting base. Understand this is the goal. Everything that you think is normal in the world that you interact with, where you read your financial press, your online stories, and you have all the apps in your hand telling you buy this, sell that, etc. The plethora of investment options you have available in a market-centric world, which assumes that with this app or an investment platform, you can just invest all around the world. That's the paradigm that's changing. It's changing as the world fragments because you won't be able to put your money everywhere. It's changing in terms of where trade flows will go, and entire supply chains from upstream to downstream are shifting. It will change in terms of the currency that's being used in order to force that change to happen. And it will change in terms of how government wants you to invest. For example, instead of being completely free to choose, you will start to see actions such as the ones taken in the UK, where we are seeing rumors that the chancellor there, in what was a very free trade country and an open capital country, will basically say to local pension funds, you have to put more of your money into British stocks or British assets, which is, of course, a classic treatment that you see in emerging markets all the time. So understand, to a degree, you're not going to have the choices that you used to have. But by front running this and understanding where it's likely to happen, you can still benefit from it. There are opportunities here as well as threats, but the biggest threat is not seeing it coming.
And Mr. Michael, in order to US to start producing everything again, do you think this is going to be a very inflationary process?
Well, it depends who you ask. Any traditional economist, and I have been one, I am not one now. Any traditional economist will tell you, yes, of course, it has to mean that. And to a degree, they are right. You will see cost pressures emerge in a system when you shift away from a China-centric system where cost of production doesn't really matter because companies and the country can run a loss indefinitely in order to gain market share. I mean, you have to wonder how long that would be the case. Ultimately, once they control everything, the logic would be for them to put the price up and there would be no competition because, the entire supply chain is in one country. And that's how the Europeans and the Americans have done it in the past. That's the game. But I don't think it's a clear-cut thing that it's all inflationary everywhere. First of all, as I just alluded to, it can be deflationary in others. For example, US tariffs right now are seeing Chinese deflation get much worse. Suddenly they have lots of excess product they can't sell. They're having to slash prices to try and sell it. So, for example, if you look at some of the Chinese EVs, which are very good, by the way, I'm not trying to criticize the product. There are reports, not my own, but there are reports out there saying every car they sell, they lose money on. The more they sell, the more money they lose. In capitalism, that's supposed to end your company, end the product, and see capital reallocated. That won't happen. This is something we need to understand. The system is changing. So we have deflation there. Okay. But in the US too, after you have the initial inflationary surge, which you probably will have as scarce labor and scarce capital chases scarce resources, or too much capital chases scarce resources, actually, then everything can level off. And in fact, the ultimate logic of neo-mercantilism is things get cheaper. In any emerging market, and I've lived in many around the world, locally produced stuff is always cheaper than anything imported because it's local. And that's supposed to be the concept.
Yeah. I heard in some of your interviews, I'm pretty sure I heard that you said that financial repression is inevitable in this multipolar world. And I want to know about that a little more about that, and what advice would you give to individuals to protect their savings in that scenario?
Sure. Well, let me start with the first part. Financial repression is when you don't receive the expected return on an asset because the government intervenes one way or another. So let's take a really simple benchmark measure. You can make a strong argument that the nominal rate of interest, so the average rate of return that you should get, should be the same as nominal GDP growth. So if your economy is growing, let's say 5% in nominal terms, so that's part real, part inflation, why, on average, shouldn't you get a 5% return on what you're doing? So everything's 5% bigger in nominal terms. Why isn't your return? So let's look and see, where has that been true in the past few years? And very few places. In China, for example, inflation is negative. Okay, so does that mean your return should be negative? That's a slightly more complicated case. But you can certainly say that investors have not, or savers, to be clear, savers in China have not always got what you would expect, given how high the nominal rate of GDP growth has been. So that's still 5% in real terms. Let's say, taking away that negative inflation, because you take away the negative, that's around 8% nominal, something like that. No, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm getting the math wrong there. Let's stick with the 5% real. It's 5% real. Apologies. Early morning here. The point is, the interest rate on savers in China has not been equal to where the growth rate of the economy has been. If you look in the West, through the long period in which we had low or negative interest rates there, we still had nominal GDP growth. So we were not being adequately returned what we should have got on our savings. That's now gone. We've raised interest rates in the West, even if they're starting to come down again. But what we are now going to see, I think, is governments increasingly arguing, okay, we need capital to go here, we need capital to go here, but with our very high debt loads, which we have, we are not going to be in a position to be able to carry that interest burden. Therefore, one way or another, we are going to see burden sharing. So interest rates may be cut when it's inappropriate, given where the level of inflation is. Bond yields may be suppressed, which we see in Europe, for example. There's an official mechanism to prevent the spread between key Eurozone government bond yields getting out of line. So we already have financial repression to a degree, but the logical argument is more of it will happen. And the clear corollary of that as an individual investor is that therefore you want to move and hold hard assets. Now, I'm not here to sell any product whatsoever, nor am I here to give any financial advice, to be abundantly clear. But there are plenty of people out there who do that, and our ideas overlap in the simple logic that, yes, if something is repressed, you try and find something that isn't. The problem is, with economic statecraft, that gets harder. You see, in economic policy, when we had QE and negative interest rates, for example, so we cut the interest rate to negative, but the government doesn't really do anything in the economy and says, well, we expect the market to work. So what do you do with this flood of liquidity? You buy property. That was a good investment. You buy stocks. They went through the roof, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that was a really easy trade. You buy commodities. Maybe they go up too. Once you have economic statecraft in play, the government probably doesn't want that to happen. For example, Trump leans on the Federal Reserve or appoints new people to the Federal Reserve, and they slash interest rates, hypothetically. Logically, you want to buy property. Logically, you want to buy commodities. Logically, you want to buy things like gold. Okay, fair enough. Does that help the US as it's involved in what it sees as an existential struggle? Does that help the Pentagon if people are putting all their private sector energy into property? Not at all. Does it help the US if the market is putting all its cash into commodities as interest rates come down? No, that makes every military product in America more expensive. So the next phase of financial repression is likely to be, yep, we've forced down interest rates lower than they would be in a market system, but we're not going to let you put your money where it would make an easy return. We only want it to go into the areas where it's good for America Inc. or China Inc. or Europe Inc. And again, I'm not making a forecast on any of these fronts here, but what I am saying very clearly is that the underlying geopolitical logic is that there will be fewer and fewer open choices where you can say, well, okay, I'll buy that, that will adjust. The only ones that you could see that maybe might do that, for the moment, obviously you still have precious metals, but they've obviously had a very bad week as we're talking, and they are political. And at any point, any government can say, you can't trade them anymore. America did that in the 1930s with gold. So nothing is completely sacrosanct. once geopolitics is in play. And the other one is some form of crypto. But again, crypto's had a very, very bad month, as we're talking, as a generic asset class. And that leaves maybe only Bitcoin. But again, that means you are talking about a government-backed asset, because America is now backing Bitcoin. So it's again the government directing where they want your cash to go. And then you have to start asking, well, why do they want that? Why do they want me to be buying this? And you have to consider that.
And I live in Mexico. I'm Venezuelan, but I live in Mexico. I also live in Ecuador many years, and of course, I have to ask you this: what does the return of the Monroe Doctrine mean for Mexico, Central America, and South America, and how should the countries in the region can prepare for tensions with China and Russia?
Well, let's first of all say the return of the Monroe Doctrine is no surprise. The day that Donald Trump was re-elected, I published a long report arguing that we would move from economic policy to economic statecraft without any attempt to hide it, that markets weren't ready for it, and that they had to understand that one of the elements that the US would use would be the Monroe Doctrine. 100%. I even mentioned the Panama Canal as being a flashpoint, and Venezuela. And obviously, these have re-emerged. From a Trump perspective or a US perspective, if you're going to have a global struggle against Russia and China, you have to make sure that your own house is in order. So on the very, very basic level, are the borders secure? So that's something they've started to work on in a very paranoid fashion, but they're doing it. Okay, it's done. After that, you look at Canada and Mexico. So without getting into the long grass, and obviously your viewers will have a far closer view of this and a much more granular grasp of all the intricacies. But it was clear to me from a helicopter view that Mexico and Canada would be told, look, the USMCA is run by us, which it is, and you have to match our tariff on China. So if you want internal free trade with the US, you can't do external free trade with China on your own terms. That was already alluded to in the previous reworking of the USMCA, from NAFTA to the USMCA. I'm sure it will be even more strongly stated going forward. And let me be really clear here. This obviously is very offensive to Canadians in particular, but just as much so to Mexicans. You don't have full sovereignty if that happens. You effectively become a member of a European Union, but without the political union. So there's no parliament, there's no advisory mechanism. It will just be America saying, okay, tariffs on China are now 100%, so your tariff on China has to be 100%. I mean, there are huge opportunities for Mexico in particular within that paradigm, huge opportunities, but it involves massive dislocation, massive volatility at the same time. Same is true for Canada, which is having a much, much harder time accepting it because they never wanted to admit to themselves that that's the status they actually had with the US. But under Trump, that's true. And it will probably be true under future presidents. So for broader Latin America, then you extend down. The Panama Canal is critical. So obviously you see Trump leaning on them. They've already started to move away from China. And then all the action now is on Colombia, Venezuela, Brazil. And if we take them one by one, so Colombia was in the US camp for a very long time. Then, of course, we had the recent election. It's gone back the other way. Let's just say America's not happy about that. Let's just park that there. Venezuela, obviously, we know where Venezuela has been for a very long time. And again, there's nothing I can say about Venezuela that you don't know. A million times better than me. But clearly, in the long run, and I don't know how long the long run is, the US would like Venezuelan oil to be flowing back towards it, not to Cuba, and to be ensuring that Venezuela is firmly in the US pocket. Because from a strategic perspective, if you've got Canadian oil locked in, and US oil and the shale gas, and shale oil, and you've got Venezuelan oil and Guyana next door, oh, you're good. You're good. That's it. The US is energy good for 100 years. Okay, I mean, rough figure, but you get what I mean. And then you have Brazil, which, under Lula, obviously, is looking much more towards the BRICS. Under Bolsonaro, it was more, looking towards the US, but obviously countries can change one side to the other. The US is very unlikely to allow that important a country in Latin America to be firmly in the BRICS bloc, purely because A, it works against the Monroe Doctrine, and B, because if you're looking at geostrategic pressure points, they come down to resources. And the resources are energy, and Brazil has energy too. And things like iron ore, and Brazil has iron ore too. And food. And Brazil, just like the US, is an agricultural superpower. So let me give you one bullet point. If Brazil worked with the US, imagine they were very close allies. Between the two of them, they can determine what Asia does and doesn't eat to a degree. So, China, if it can't buy soybeans from the US, it will buy them from Argentina and Brazil. And I'll come to Argentina in just one second. I forgot to mention them a moment ago. I'm sorry. But if Brazil works with the US and both the US and Brazil together say no soybeans, well, that really, really starts to disrupt the food complex in China. So I would imagine after Venezuela and Colombia, the US will be focusing on Brazil, but you have to maybe focus on those two first in order to build up momentum. And of course, I should have mentioned it. Apologies. Friday morning here. Argentina is very much in the press too. We've got an election coming up this weekend. I don't know whether your viewers will see this before or after the result, but you've had the US offering $40 billion as a stabilization package if they vote the right way.
Yeah.
So it's very clear that they want a pro-US counterparty there. So one by one, I hope I'm talking on the key pressure points, but you can see that if they get that all lined up, they're so much stronger to then look at every other region in the world.
Yeah. And well, that's a very interesting point. And you know that I saw this little exchange you had with Luke Roman in Twitter, and he argues that gold is a physical manifestation of force and that China uses it to control energy prices. How do you can rebut that, and what role do you see for gold in China's strategy?
None. I mean, Luke is a friend, and we interact regularly, on a personal basis, communicating and exchanging ideas. And I have an enormous amount of respect for him. I think he's a fantastic thought leader. He's been well ahead of the curve on many things, and we agree on a huge amount. To be abundantly clear, where we have a disagreement, and we've done that on podcasts and on other interactions, is I don't see this magical gold oil ratio as actually meaning anything. If you start with that view, and obviously he's very firmly of it, then everything rotates around it. It's similar to any kind of precept or ideological construct. Like if you're a Marxist, everything is about the labor theory of value. Everything starts with that. If you're a free trader, everything is about free markets, free trade, it becomes a mantra. And does it mean it's always true or not true? No, it can be true and not true at different times. That's all of them can be. But I don't see the gold to oil matters. And my debunking of that, for what it's worth, is that he believes that if the US were to devalue versus gold, or gold prices were to go much higher, and the US dollar goes down against gold, and so gold becomes a kind of a neutral international asset. China goes up versus gold, the US goes down versus gold, and at that point, the US can reindustrialize because, suddenly everything balances again. It's cheaper, and factories will go back to the US. I mean, you can make that argument for other neutral reserve assets. You could make the argument just the dollar could devalue versus the renminbi. The dollar could go way, way, way weaker versus the renminbi, and that would do the same thing. And my argument is no, it won't, because neo-mercantilists don't care about markets. And China is a neo-mercantilist. There is no price of gold or dollar renminbi or anything that would make Beijing say, oh, okay, you have all the factories now. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah. Pricing signals now tell us all of our industry should be hollowed out and go to America the same way that it happened from America to us. There's no world in which that happens. China's focus is on maintaining control of supply chains. Understandably, I would too in their position. So that the market, to my mind, is irrelevant. That doesn't mean gold can't go up. Gold can go up and it can come down. But it won't balance anything.
Okay.
There's no happy, peaceful solution globally because gold. In the same way, there isn't because markets.
Yeah, yeah. And last question, and well, first of, I want to tell you thank you because it's a privilege to interview you, and I really enjoyed it. So, the last question is, what do you think the U.S. will do while it remains dependent on China, especially for rare earth supplies, given that it will take at least 5 years to secure its own supply chain? In what position does this leave the U.S. in that regard?
It's a very good question. In fact, that is the key question, because clearly the US is going to throw everything it has with allies at creating its own rare earth supply chains, which are not rare, but which are highly polluting. And you'll have to rip up all your environmental permits and destroy some locations in order to achieve it. And you will have to restructure your economy because you'll have a free market alternative, which costs X. And you'll say, no, I want you to invest $10 billion to create a product that costs 3X. And capitalists will say, well, that doesn't make any sense. So every element of the economy will have to be restructured to make it make sense. You'll have to have tariffs. You'll have to have subsidies. You'll have to have directed capital, which is exactly economic statecraft. And I expect all of these things to happen. But in the interim, yes, China can stop US industry. European industry is already panicking about the fact that it may not get chips from China now after what Nexperia did in the Netherlands, seizing a Chinese company. So China can turn off the taps. And then what can the US do? Well, lots. They're talking about turning off software to China, which could freeze what they do. And I was saying to clients recently, the tail risks, and I want to stress tail risks, but we're already seeing some of them, are that both sides understand the best tool to make the other one understand what they want is to disrupt supply chains from upstream. Because China, for example, their factories are fantastic and they're in China and they're safe. They're there. They need raw materials. US military power can still access those trade routes long before China can get to them. Now, let me give you a parallel, which is not related to the US-China directly, but it's the same thing. I was saying to these clients, I can see risks to upstream supply chains in commodities. This week in Europe, we've had 3 oil refineries blow up. 3. One in Romania, one in Hungary, one in Slovakia. All of them processed Russian oil or refined Russian oil. 3 in a week. So yeah, that's the kind of thing where suddenly supply chains can have mysterious events like Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, etc. At which point the other team understands, yeah, well, okay, I have the good card here, but I can't get the raw material. And I have the factory that prints the cards. So not only do I hold the cards, I make the cards, but the raw materials that make the cards come from another country over there, and there's an American aircraft carrier. And then we have a standoff, and nobody knows where that goes. You can either be an optimist and say that a resolution is reached where both sides realize, okay, we don't want to damage each other too much. Let's gradually have a tapering plan to separate. You'll get rare earths, I'll get this. We have 2 different blocks with something in the middle. That's an organized system. Or it escalates and escalates. And I can't tell you which will happen. I can tell you which I want to happen. But none of them, to loop back to where we started, are because markets and how do I make money from markets today? None of them are that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Michael. It's been an honor, as I said, and I just want to ask, where can people find you? People that will watch this interview, where they can go and find things that you say or things that you write.
Sure. So first of all, our primary resource at Rabobank is Rabobank Knowledge. You do have to be a client of ours to access most of the stuff there. So go and check it out because there is some publicly available stuff too. Secondly, some of my work is available on LinkedIn. You can see that there. I'm often on different media platforms, such as this one, either directly in an interview or some of my work being reposted to various different places. And I am on social media too. You can look at X at the Michael Every, all one word. And I like to continue these kind of conversations there, because the more interactions you have with more different people who are involved in different aspects of this, the more well-rounded your view becomes. So please do feel free to reach out and let's continue the conversation.
Yeah, you're right. And I'm one of those people that follow you on Twitter, and it's very productive to read you. Well, thank you so much for being with us, and thank you guys for being there. Remember to share this and go to elmercurioaon.com, and we'll see you next week.